Hi, everyone. Today we will work on TOEFL Speaking Task 4. The key to achieving a high score is to provide a coherent narrative that is rich in details, which means careful and organized note-taking. The question is to summarize the lecture, so it depends on the content of the lecture. Therefore, you should anticipate the question as you listen to the lecture. This will help you determine what details are relevant and what are not. Today, we will show you how to predict the question as you listen to the lecture so that you can take effective notes. We will consider 3 different types of Task 4 lectures. One that only talks about differences, a second that discusses both similarities and differences, and a third that describes an experiment. But let's first examine the format of Task 4. How to predict the question. Your essential task for Task 4 is to summarize academic content logically, covering all key points supported by details. It involves a listening part that is delivered in a lecture style. The lecture is about 2 minutes long. You have 20 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds for your response. The typical questions ask you to explain the main idea of the lecture using the examples discussed. Here are sample examples of typical questions. Using the examples of sharks and jellyfish, explain how animals cooperate with each other. Using the points and examples from the lecture, explain the 2 pricing strategies described by the professor. The first question is about animal cooperation, illustrated by 2 examples, and the second question is about 2 pricing strategies. Recently, the questions have been asking about both similarities and differences, as the lecture discusses both. Be prepared for these tweaks in the question. Based on the lecture, explain what the similarities and differences between socialism and communism are. Based on the lecture, explain what the similarities and differences between transmission electron microscopes, TEM, and scanning electron microscopes, SEM, are. While far less common, the lecture can also talk about just one example that describes a fact or experiment. These are sample questions of that type. Using the research described by the professor, explain what scientists have learned about the mathematical abilities of babies. Using the example of the Thunderbird, explain a possible effect of a major climate change. In these 2 questions, we can tell the lecture must be about one example. Lecture organization. The first challenge with Task 4 is that the question is given after the lecture, not before. Since you are given the question after the lecture, you need to expect the question in advance while listening to the lecture. To do that, you need to know how the lecture is organized. Task 4 lectures typically consist of an introduction and a body. If there are 2 examples, there is no conclusion part. If the lecture has only one example, it usually does have a conclusion part that recaps the main point. Most Task 4 lectures usually have 2 examples. With the 2 example format, the lecture can be divided into 3 parts: introduction to the topic, first example, and second example. The lecture is often about 2 characteristics of something, such as 2 features, 2 benefits, 2 problems, 2 causes, or 2 methods. You can expect what the question will be at the end of the introduction part of the lecture. If the lecturer says something like 2 examples that illustrate the topic, then the question will be to explain the 2 items in the body. Examples with introductory lecture remarks. Let's consider examples with introductory lecture remarks. Consider this example. So, of course, many animals live in groups with others of their species, and there are benefits to living together in groups. It can help animals survive. But there are also certain disadvantages. So today we're going to talk about 2 disadvantages of living in groups for animals. From these remarks, we know that the question will be about 2 disadvantages of living in groups for animals. So you need to take notes accordingly, focusing on 2 disadvantages in the remaining lecture. Another example. So, we've been talking about forest fires, and usually when a forest fire occurs, the animals in the area will of course run away, flee as fast as they can so as not to get hurt by the flames. Some animals, though, actually benefit from forest fires, and so will seek them out because forest fires can help them fulfill certain survival needs. Let's discuss 2 benefits forest fires can have for these animals. One benefit is that So we know that the question will be about 2 benefits of forest fires for some animals. Some introductory remarks provide more information. Consider this one. So most cities of the ancient world tended to be small, often limited to the banks of a river. They had very little means to expand. These old cities couldn't really cross natural barriers like rivers or be located very far from water sources. But Roman cities, on the other hand, grew much larger. How did this happen? Well, for one thing, the Romans had more advanced technology. Let's look at a couple of Roman developments that allowed their cities to expand. So the question should be about two developments that allowed ancient Roman cities to expand. This lecture actually provides more context as it talks about two limitations for city expansions, which are old cities couldn't really cross natural barriers like rivers or be located very far from water sources. So you can expect that the main part of the lecture will explain how Roman cities overcame these two types of challenges, allowing them to expand. Single example lectures. Infrequently, the lecture provides one example, which is often an experiment. An experiment is conducted to demonstrate that a claim is true or that a traditional view is incorrect. Consider these introductory remarks where the professor makes claims. You need to jot down the claims and expect that the rest of the lecture will be about experiments that vindicate the claims. Let's take a listen to this introductory part of the lecture. Psychologists used to believe that babies become attached to the person who feeds them. Makes sense, right? Babies depend on others to provide nourishment to keep them alive. But most psychologists now believe otherwise. Today, most psychologists think that a warm and loving touch is actually more important than feeding. In this introductory part, the professor offers two contrasting ideas. One, the old refuted view, and the other, the new view that the lecture aims to show to be true. Both views are about how babies are attached to a person, called bonding. So two theories of bonding are proposed. The old theory is the feeding view that babies attach to the person who feeds them. The second, more recent view is the loving touch theory that babies attach to someone who touches them warmly and lovingly. You can expect that the professor will talk about an experiment where the subjects of the experiment were treated differently. One group was treated based on traditional belief, by just feeding, and the other by loving touch. Sample lectures, note-taking, and top-scoring responses. Now that we know how to predict the question, let's take notes and formulate answers based on the notes. We will consider three types of lectures. The first lecture only talks about differences, so we can expect that the question will be about the difference between the two items in the lecture. The second lecture describes both similarities and differences, so we can expect that the question will correspondingly ask you to describe similarities and differences. And the third lecture has one example that is an experiment. Lecture 1. Let's begin with the first lecture. Let's listen.
You will listen to a lecture about an academic topic. After, you will get a question about what you heard. You will have 20 seconds to prepare your response and then 60 seconds to give it. Now listen to the lecture.
Marketing is a crucial aspect of business that helps a company create brand recognition and establish a robust connection with its target audience. While there are several strategies used in marketing, let's zoom in on the cost-based pricing method and the value-based pricing method. Cost-based pricing is a strategy.
This is the introduction part, and we know that the question will be explaining in detail what the cost-based pricing strategy and value-based pricing strategy are. Let's listen to the first part of the body lecture, which will be the cost-based pricing strategy.
Whereby a business calculates the cost of production for a product and adds a percentage markup to determine its selling price. A common example is how retail stores handle their products. They buy goods at wholesale prices and add a specific percentage on top to cover overhead costs and profit. Value-based pricing, on the other hand.
So we know that we are moving into the second example. So what is the cost-based pricing strategy based on the notes? Cost-based pricing and value-based pricing. Cost-based pricing involves setting prices based on the production cost of a product and the markup, which is the amount added to the cost price of goods to cover overhead and profit. This pricing strategy is clear in retail stores that determine the final product price based on wholesale price and markup percentage that covers overhead and profits. Now let's listen to the second example on value-based pricing strategy.
Involves determining a product's price based on the perceived value to the customer rather than the actual cost of making the product. This strategy often sees use in the luxury goods market, where the value is tied more to intangible elements like brand prestige and emotional appeal. For example, designer brands like Gucci and Louis Vuitton can sell their products at high prices despite their production costs, not necessarily reflecting these high price tags. By understanding the difference between this two,
Value-based pricing focuses on the perceived value of the product or service to the customer. This strategy allows companies to charge higher prices for products perceived as more valuable, regardless of production costs. Luxury brands like Louis Vuitton and Gucci use this strategy as some people feel prestige or exclusivity with this type of product, which allows charging premium prices for their products. The differences between these two. We know that this last part is a conclusion. Let's listen.
Business can make an informed decision on which pricing strategy to apply, taking into account its production costs, target market, and the value proposition of its products.
The conclusion recaps the main point of the lecture. You do not need a conclusion, but if you have time, you could wrap up your response by mentioning that these two pricing strategies allow businesses to maximize profits and satisfy customer needs.
Explain the difference between cost-based pricing and value-based pricing in marketing strategies. Provide examples discussed in the lecture.
So the key points you must cover are that the cost-based strategy determines the pricing based on the cost of the product plus markup. And the example is the retail store's method of calculating the price of their products. And for the value-based strategy, it capitalizes on customer perception and willingness to pay for exclusivity. And the example is luxury brands. So this is a sample response.
Prepare your response after the beep.
The two most common pricing strategies are cost-based pricing and value-based pricing. Cost-based pricing involves setting prices based on the production cost of a product plus a markup. This markup covers overhead and profit. Retail stores often use this strategy, determining the final product price based on the wholesale price and a markup percentage. Value-based pricing, on the other hand, focuses on the perceived value of the product or service to the customer. This strategy allows companies to charge higher prices for products perceived as more valuable, regardless of production costs. Luxury brands like Louis Vuitton and Gucci use this strategy, as some customers associate their products with prestige and exclusivity. This perception allows these brands to charge premium prices. Both strategies aim to maximize profits while satisfying customer needs. Lecture 2. Moving on to the next lecture, let's take a listen for the intro part to anticipate the question.
Communism and socialism are often used interchangeably to refer to the same economic idea. But these are two different philosophies that have some similarities and some big differences. Communism and socialism came with the rise of the Industrial Revolution.
Now let's analyze this lecture. Here the lecturer mentions both similarities and differences, so we know that the question will be about both characteristics. Since the sentence begins with communism and socialism, we know that similarities are presented first. Let's take notes on similarities.
And they criticized the business owners who were becoming wealthy by exploiting their workers. They both saw this situation as unsustainable and in dire need of a change. They both advocated the idea that an individual should contribute based on their own ability. Also, they emphasized the importance of government and collectives. They thought that we needed a more centralized structure that will be a producer of good that are required by the public. And the same would go for investment and planning. According to these two ideologies, the government would be deciding where to invest the resources. The most fundamental difference is that
since he explicitly mentions differences, we are finished with the similarities. The professor provides several similarities. Wealth accumulation through exploitation is unstable. This exploitation method of wealth creation must be changed to individual contribution modes, where individuals contribute to the production based on their own ability. It should be the government that makes the decisions on production, investment, and resource allocation. Let's listen for the differences.
under communism, individuals are provided goods based on their needs. You'd simply be given what the government thinks you need in terms of food, clothing, accommodation, etc. But in socialism, individuals are compensated for based on their individual contribution. So people that work harder or smarter would receive more than those that don't contribute. Another key difference is that communism doesn't accept the notion of private property. Socialism states that personal property exists. People can have their personal belongings, but all industrial production is owned by the public and managed by the government.
So these are the differences. In communism, resources are distributed based on what they believe to be needed for each individual. By contrast, in socialism, resources are distributed based on individual contribution. So if someone worked harder or is more talented, they can have more. The other main difference relates to private property. Communists reject private property. By contrast, although they do believe that the means of industrial production must be owned by the public, socialists acknowledge private property.
What are the similarities and the differences between socialism and communism? Include points and examples from the lecture.
So the key points you must cover are that regarding the similarities, both communism and socialism find that the exploitation method of becoming rich is unstable, and instead, individual contribution should be how wealth should be created. Two differences are mentioned in the lecture. One is the resource allocation, where communists believe in need-based, and socialists believe in contribution-based distribution. The other difference is whether to recognize private property. This is a sample response.
Prepare your response after the beep.
Communism and socialism share several key similarities. Both ideologies recognize that wealth accumulation through exploitation is unstable and unsustainable. They propose changing this method of wealth creation to one based on individual contributions, where people contribute to production according to their abilities. Additionally, both systems advocate for government control over major economic decisions, including production, investment, and resource allocation. However, there are significant differences between communism and socialism. The first major difference lies in resource distribution. In communism, resources are distributed based on perceived individual needs. In contrast, socialism distributes resources based on individual contributions, allowing those who work harder or have more talent to receive more. The second key difference concerns private property. Communists reject the concept of private property entirely. Socialists, while believing that the means of industrial production should be publicly owned, do acknowledge and allow for private property in other areas. These similarities and differences highlight the nuanced relationship between communism and socialism, two related but distinct economic and political philosophies. Moving on to the last lecture of the day. Let's take a listen to the intro part and determine what the question will be.
Now listen to part of a lecture in a psychology class. The professor is discussing the mathematical capabilities of babies.
Scientists have learned some interesting things about the intellectual abilities of babies. They say there's evidence that babies as young as 5 months old can do basic arithmetic, that they can add. Scientists think babies know that 1 + 1 = 2 and not 1. The evidence is indirect because obviously you can't ask a 5-month-old baby to add up some numbers for you. So they devised an experiment where, in this experiment, a baby is shown a doll on.
Since the professor begins to describe the experiment itself, we can tell that she is beginning the body part. In the case of an experiment, we need to make notes. So the professor introduces a claim that babies can do basic math, and we know this through an experiment. So you can expect that the question is to describe the experiment that vindicates the claim of babies' math ability. Unlike the previous lecture, where differences or items are clearly mentioned, describing an experiment can be quite challenging if you just write down the words. You need to think about how the experiment is devised. There will be a setup, there will be a specific procedure, and then a conclusion based on the setup and procedure. So focus on that aspect. Let's take a listen to the experiment.
A table. Okay, so the baby looks at the doll. Then the researcher lowers a screen in front of the doll. So now the doll's hidden behind the screen. But the baby's already seen the doll and so knows it's there. Well, then the researcher takes a second doll and very obviously places it behind the screen with the first one. Okay, so now you have two dolls behind the screen, right? Well, no, because what the researchers did was they secretly took away one of the dolls. And then when they raise the screen back up, the baby, well, it expects to see two dolls, right? But there's only one there. And guess what? The baby's surprised. It expects two, but it only sees one. How could the researchers tell that the baby's surprised? Well, they recorded the baby's eye movements on camera. And we know that when a baby is surprised by something, a loud noise or an unexpected flash of light maybe, it stares at where the noise or light is coming from. And that's what the babies in the experiment did. They stared, because a baby knows that if you add one doll and one doll, you should have two dolls. So when it sees one doll, then it stares because it's surprised.
Researchers place a doll on the table. So babies know there is a doll. Researchers lower a screen in front of the baby and place another doll behind the screen. So there should be two dolls, but actually, the researchers secretly took away one doll, so there is one doll actually. Researchers then raise the screen. The baby is surprised to see one doll. Why was the baby surprised? Because the baby expected to see two dolls. The professor adds that we know the baby was surprised because they record the eye movement, and when babies are surprised, they stare, and the baby indeed stared. Since the baby is surprised to see one doll, the baby must have expected to see two dolls. This fact that the baby was surprised allows the researchers to conclude that babies can do 1 + 1 = 2.
Using the research described by the professor, explain what scientists have learned about the mathematical abilities of babies.
The key points here are that babies can do basic math, since in the experiment, the baby was surprised to see one doll, indicating that they expected two dolls and can therefore do simple addition. This is a sample response.
Prepare your response after the beep.
Scientists have discovered that babies possess basic math skills through a cleverly designed experiment. In this study, researchers first placed a doll on a table in front of a baby. They then lowered a screen in front of the baby and added another doll behind it. From the baby's perspective, there should now be two dolls behind the screen. However, the researchers secretly removed one doll, leaving only one. When they raised the screen, revealing just one doll, the baby showed surprise. Researchers know that the baby is surprised because they recorded the baby's eye movements. It's known that babies stare when they're surprised. And in this case, the baby indeed stared at the single doll. This reaction is crucial because it indicates that the baby expected to see two dolls, not one. This behavior strongly suggests that the baby had mentally added the two dolls together and was confused when the result didn't match their expectation. Thank you for listening. If you would like more high-scoring strategies on TOEFL speaking and hundreds of sample responses, check out Dr. Burns' website, www.nanhyburns.com. Let us know if you have any questions about today's lecture. Have a good day.